Hi, this is Chris Romer, President and CEO of Vail Valley Partnership. I'm really honored to be joined today by Reeves Brown from Building a Better Colorado. And I'm going to let Reeves talk a little bit about their organization and his background as part of this. But we're here today to talk about what is the Gallagher Amendment and how will it impact Coloradans in 2021. This is a big issue. It's on the ballot locally here in Eagle County with the county, the town of Vail, the town of Avon, Eagle River Fire Protection District, and the town of Eagle. And of course, it's also on the statewide ballot as Amendment B. So Reeves, we really appreciate you taking the time today to spend with us and to walk through this rather complicated issue. You've done as good a job, a much better job than anyone I've seen being able to explain this in layman's terms. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and talk about this. I want to thank you personally in the Vail Valley Partnership for your continued leadership on this and so many other issues that are just critically important to our state. This is a complex issue, and it's critical that thought leaders like your constituency within the partnership understand this issue and be able to communicate it to others. So delighted to be here today. I'm going to run through some slides and explain what the Gallagher Amendment is, how we expect it to uniquely impact Colorado in 2021. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the ballot measure, Amendment B, which you referenced, that proposes to repeal the Gallagher Amendment. Representing Building a Better Colorado, I won't suggest how people should vote on that ballot measure because Building Better Colorado takes no position on that or any other policy measure. Building Better Colorado is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy group, but I will explain it. So let's jump into this and run through these slides. To understand the Gallagher Amendment, you have to understand what property taxes are because property taxes are all about what the Gallagher Amendment addresses. Property taxes are assessed locally. They are collected locally. They are spent locally. They entirely benefit the funding of local services. The state receives no property tax. The state has not had a property tax since 1964. And you can see from this chart, this pie chart, that fully half of all property taxes that are collected locally across the state benefit K through 12. It's the local share of the local state partnership to fund K through 12. It's the largest share of your state general fund budget. It's usually the largest share of your local budget as well. Another fourth of property taxes pays for all county services. So county administration, county roads, county sheriff, all county services. And 20% of property taxes pays for all special districts. So the fire district, ambulance district, emergency services district, the library district, recreational district, all special districts. Cities get a very small slice of property tax, about 5%. But of course, cities' primary revenue source is sales tax. Also, to understand Gallagher, you have to understand how property taxes are calculated, which is a very simple two-step formula. Your property tax bill is simply the assessed value of your property, which is the market value of your property. So think of your house here. Whatever you could sell your house for times the appropriate assessment rate for your class of property. And the assessment rate dictates how much of your property is actually subject to be taxed because no property is taxed at 100% of its market value. And you can see on this table that the assessment rates that we put into the Constitution in 1982 for various classes of property, all property in the state, farmland in Sterling, small businesses in Vail, houses, not houses, but vacant land in Grand Junction, industrial property in Durango, all property in the state is taxed at 29% of its total market value, except houses. And this is where the Gallagher Amendment comes in. Gallagher dictates that houses are taxed on a unique formula, and it currently amounts to 7.15% of the house's market value. So again, you take the market value of your property times the appropriate assessment rate for your class of property to arrive at the assessed value, how much of your property is subject to be taxed, and then you simply multiply that by the number of mills, the mill levy, that the voters in your area have approved to fund all local services. Each mill that voters approve generates $1 for every $1,000 of assessed valuation. So I'm going to put some numbers in here and walk through this so you can kind of see how this works. If you had a $500,000 house, The assessment rate on that per the Constitution, because of the Gallagher Amendment, is 7.15%. Therefore, of your $500,000 house, only $36,000 is actually subject to be taxed. And if you live in an area where the voters have approved 60 mills to fund all those local services, each mill generates $1 for every $1,000 of assessed value. So 60 times 36, the annual tax bill on your $500,000 house is $2,160. And that pays for that pie chart of local services. Half of the $2,160 pays for the local share of K through 12. A fourth of it pays for all county services. 20% pays for all special districts. So where did the Gallagher Amendment come from? The Gallagher Amendment was referred to voters in 1982 by the state legislature. And at that time in Colorado, of all property in the state, skyscrapers in downtown Denver and houses in Durango and farmland in Lamar and vacant land, industrial property, oil and gas production, all property in the state, houses made up about 45% of the total valuation in the state. And the Gallagher Amendment simply said, that's a good ratio. Let's keep it forever. And so when the voters adopted the Gallagher Amendment in 1982, they effectively froze in time that forevermore, the total value of houses across the state would never represent more or less than about 45% of total property valuation statewide, and everything else would make up the other 55%. So why did the legislature refer the Gallagher Amendment to voters in 1982? Well, if you were here in the 70s, 60s, 70s, you know, Colorado was experiencing some pretty significant population growth. Colorado had kind of been discovered as an international ski destination. And all those people moving here was driving up the value of houses, which was driving up residential property taxes. And that was causing people to call their legislator. And the legislature's response was the Gallagher Amendment to freeze residential share of the total statewide valuation at 45%. At that time in 1982, we thought that population growth was kind of an anomaly. And it turns out that it wasn't an anomaly. We've seen significant population growth in Colorado for 40 years. And all of those people moving here, not surprisingly, has dramatically grown the value of residential property statewide. You can see in this chart in the blue line how much the value in residential property has grown, outpaced the growth of the value of everything else in the state in the brown line. The everything else being anything that's not a house. So the brown line represents office buildings, farmland, vacant land, industrial property, oil and gas production, everything else. Houses have grown year over year, every year since 1983, since we adopted the Gallagher Amendment, except for a brief 4-year window during the national subprime mortgage meltdown. Other than that, house values have grown irrespective of the economy. So much so, today, houses make up 80% of total property valuation statewide, and everything else has shrunk to just 20% of total valuation. But when we adopted the Gallagher Amendment in 1982, we said that's not possible. Houses can only make up 45%. So how does your legislature make 80% equal 45% to comply with your constitutional mandate? Well, you have to go back to our formula. If Gallagher says that the assessed valuation of all the houses in the state can only make up 45% of total property valuation statewide, and yet the market value of houses is rising faster than the market value of all other property, the only way to keep houses at 45% is to shrink the assessment rate, how much of each house is actually subject to be taxed. And so that's what we've done for 38 years. Prior to the adoption of the Gallagher Amendment in 1982, all property in the state was taxed at 30% of its total market value. When we adopted the Gallagher Amendment, we immediately dropped the assessment rate on houses to 21%, and then we put it on a formula that was intended to go up or down as may be necessary to keep the total value of houses at 45% of total valuation statewide. Everything else at the time was then frozen at 29% instead of 30%. And because residential values, again, have so far outpaced the growth in the value of everything else, Gallagher has forced that residential rate to continue to go down to keep house values at 45% of the total. Today, the residential rate again is down to 7.15%. Conversely, the rate that other property owners pay, like small businesses, has grown relative to the residential rate. Back in 1982, again, all property was taxed at 30%. It was an equal assessment rate. Today, the assessment rate for all other property and business owners is 4 times the assessment rate, 29% versus 7.15%. So just to kind of put some numbers to this, so to help understand it, in 1981, if you had a $300,000 house, all property was taxed at 30% at that time. If you lived in a 60 mil district, your annual tax bill was $5,400 to fund that pie chart of services. Today, if you have that same $300,000 house, and I'm adjusting the math here for inflation just to keep the math simple, but if you had a $300,000 house today, only 7.15% is subject to inflation. If you live in the same 60 mil district, your tax bill, property tax bill in inflation adjusted dollars is dropped below $1,300, about a fourth of what it was 35 years ago. And that's happened on every house in the state. And that's eroded that residential property tax base that pays for local services. Conversely, if you are a business owner, your tax rate is frozen at 29% and has been since 1983. And so prior to that, if you had a $300,000 business, again, all property at that time was taxed at 30%. So your tax bill was the same as your $300,000 house. It was $5,400. Today, if you have that same $300,000 business adjusted for inflation, you have a fixed rate of 29%, and therefore your tax bill is about the same, $5,220. But it's 4 times as much as what a residential owner of the same value of property is paying. So that tax burden has kind of shifted to the business community. Gallagher requires every 2 years that the legislature reevaluate the value, growth in value of all residential property compared to the growth in value of non-residential property, and then requires the legislature to adjust that residential rate up or down as may be necessary to ensure that residential property stays at no more or less than 45% of the total. So if the change in value of residential property over the last 2 years, and this calculation is about an 8-month process. It started in July and it will be delivered to the legislature in the next session, next spring. But if that calculation finds that the growth in value of residential property compared to the growth in value of non-residential property over the last 2 years doesn't change, they both grow at the same rate, then Gallagher won't necessitate any change in the residential assessment rate. But if that study finds that residential property has grown faster than the value of non-residential property, then Gallagher will require again that the residential assessment rate drops accordingly to keep residential total assessed valuation at 45%. Conversely, if the study finds that non-residential property has actually grown faster than residential property, then as it was intended, Gallagher would say that the residential assessment rate must go up to keep residential's share of the total valuation at 45%. But that can't happen and won't happen because 10 years after we adopted Gallagher in 1982, we adopted the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, TABOR, in 1992. And TABOR prohibits any tax, statewide tax, from going up without a statewide vote of the people. So the residential assessment rate can't go up without a statewide vote of the people. Which has never happened. So in that instance, the residential rate would just remain flat until a future calculation. So again, looking at that chart that we looked at earlier, the big question is recognizing that values continue to grow. Has the rate of growth of residential property been faster, slower, or equal to the rate of growth of non-residential? So we're going to blow this chart up looking at the last 10 years just so we can get a better view and take a closer look of what we expect to happen in the current calculation. So this is that same chart going back to 2009. And as concerns the growth in residential value in the current study, certainly residential values have grown, no question. And we've had a recession, obviously, since March or April. But despite the recession, residential values continue to grow. The recession has not decreased the value of houses. It has slowed the sale of some houses in some areas, but it has not decreased the value of houses. And therefore, we can expect in the current 2-year calculation that the value of houses statewide will be at an all-time high, north of $900 billion for the first time, over $900 billion. By contrast, when we look at the value of non-residential property in the brown line, there are two classes of non-residential property that are valued on two different time frames that are affected differently by the current recession. So we're going to look at both of those. The first class that we're going to look at is commercial buildings, which makes up 55% of non-residential property value statewide. That's valued on the same 2-year window as residential property. And then all other non-residential property, 40% of which is oil and gas production, is not valued on a 2-year window. That's valued on a 12-month window. So we'll look at that separately. So as concerns commercial buildings, commercial values are largely dictated by a commercial rental capacity. And given that 20% of downtown Denver is leased, commercial space is leased to oil and gas companies, and given that we've been in an oil crash since last December, we can expect that that is going to have downward pressure on the value of commercial buildings. And of course, we had the recession for 3 or 4 months of that 24-month period. And even though the recession has not affected the value of houses, it has affected the value of commercial buildings because it has depressed the economy, which is a direct reflection on commercial rental rates. So the combination of the oil crash since December and the recession since March or April, we can expect that the value of commercial buildings is probably going to see a 4 to 6% drop in the current 2-year calculation. When we look at the value of all other non-residential property, and again, 40% of this category is oil and gas production, that doesn't look at a 2-year window. That just looks at the 12 months of 2020. And obviously, the recession that started in March or April, which will constitute 9 months of that 12-month window, is going to have a more significant impact on the value of all other non-residential than it has on commercial buildings. And given that we've had an oil crash, we expect to have had it for the entirety of the 2020 12-month period, we can probably expect that the value of other non-residential property is similarly going to see a 4 to 6% drop in value. So when you add that to the 4 to 6% drop in the expected value of commercial property, we can probably expect a 10% drop in the value of non-residential property in the current 2-year calculation. So in summary, this current 2-year valuation, we expect to see an all-time record high valuation of residential property north of $900 billion, maybe a 10% drop in non-residential property. And therefore, the answer to our initial question is yes, the study is likely going to show that residential values have again outpaced the growth of non-residential. And this time it's been fairly significant because of a combination of the recession and the oil crash. So Gallagher will once again require that the legislature drop the residential assessment rate. How much will they have to drop it? That's the big question. If we look at 2019 and the numbers that were reflected in 2019, the columns on the left in the brown show that last year, the total market value of non-residential property statewide was about $224 billion. And for property tax purposes, non-residential property has an assessed valuation, property valuation of about 32% of market value. So that amounted to about $73 billion last year. Compared to the valuation of residential property last year, which had a market value of $873 billion. And the assessed value of residential property, again, is driven by the Gallagher Amendment that says that assessed value can only be 45% of the total. So if you work backwards, if the assessed value of non-residential property last year was $73 billion, then the assessed value of residential could only be $62 billion. And to arrive at that number, Gallagher required that the residential rate had to drop from 7.2% to 7.15%. So applying that same process to 2020 and using the numbers we just went through, we're expecting, again, about a 10% drop in the value of non-residential property in 2020. And at a 32% assessed valuation, that will amount to about $64 billion of assessed value statewide. Compared to residential property, if you remember, we're expecting an all-time record high north of $900 billion. And the assessed value of that residential property, again, per the Gallagher Amendment, can only be 45% of the total. So if the assessed value of non-residential property is expected to be $64 billion in 2020, then Gallagher will say that the assessed value of residential property can be no more than about $52 billion. And to arrive at that number, Gallagher will require that the residential assessment rate must drop again, this time below 6%. And that's a fairly significant drop. It's going to be about an 18 or 19% drop in the residential assessment rate, which is pretty significant compared to where we've come from and where we are today. I use just some rough numbers there in my estimates of what we expect the current 2-year assessment calculation to arrive at. But the Division of Property Taxation has subsequently come out with their forecast, and they've pegged that number at 5.88. So it's most likely going to be below 6 and probably 5.8 something. So how will a 18 or 19% drop in the residential rate affect you? It depends on if you're a homeowner or a business owner, and it depends on where you live. And more specifically, it depends on how much of your county's tax base depends on residential property to pay for local services. The more that your county depends on residential property to fund services, obviously, the more your county is going to suffer a revenue drop based on a 19 or 18% drop in the residential assessment rate. This chart just shows kind of a sampling of counties around the state. And in that center column, you can see the disparity in how much different counties depend on residential property to make up their tax base and fund local services. Counties like Adams, Chaffee, Elbert, Jefferson, Mesa County depend fairly heavily on residential property, upwards of 45, 50, up to almost 70% in Elbert County. And therefore, those counties are going to suffer a larger drop in revenue based on a 19% drop in the residential assessment rate, up to 10, 11, 13, over 13% in Elbert County's case. And that drop in revenue based on the drop in the residential assessment rate is really a permanent drop, because even though the economy will recover and market values will grow, the residential assessment rate cannot grow and cannot recover, because, again, Tabor requires a statewide vote of the people for it to ever go up, and that's why it's only gone down. And therefore, local taxing jurisdictions will have 3 choices of how to deal with this permanent drop in revenue. Number one, they can permanently reduce their services accordingly to balance the revenue budget. Number two, they can go to their voters and ask voters to raise local mill levies just enough to offset Gallagher's forced reduction of the residential rate. And oftentimes homeowners will vote for such a mill levy increase because it doesn't cost them anything. Because for homeowners, even though they're being asked to pay a higher mill levy, they're paying on a lower residential assessment rate. So it's a wash for homeowners. But remember that every other class of property, and think of small businesses here and farmers, they're fixed at a 29% rate. So every time local voters vote to raise their local mill levy just enough to sustain funding for the fire district and the school district, even though that may be a wash for homeowners, that's a real tax increase for every other class of property. So every time we vote to raise the mill levy locally, that shifts that property tax burden from homeowners to businesses. And the third option for local governments would be to kind of just cross their fingers and hope that when the economy recovers, that the underlying market value of houses will grow fast enough to mitigate the Gallagher's reduction in the residential assessment rate. And that oftentimes does happen in some communities that see significant growth consistently in the market value of residential property, such as the Front Range and the metro area particularly. But that doesn't really happen as much in rural Colorado. And therefore, Gallagher quite unintentionally and unfortunately adversely impacts rural communities much more so than metro communities, because rural communities suffer the same loss of their residential tax base, but they don't see the corresponding growth in residential values later on. So we talked about how that tax burden shifts from residential owners to business owners every time voters vote to raise the mill levy to sustain funding for local services. And this chart just shows that back in 1983, the first year we had the Gallagher Amendment, the residential rate was set at 21%, and therefore the residential property had 45% and business had 55% of the total. So for every dollar that homeowners paid in the blue, businesses paid $1.40 in property tax on the same value of property at a 21% residential assessment rate. Today, with the residential assessment rate at 7.15%, because of the growth in residential property, for every dollar that homeowners pay, businesses pay over $4, 4 times as much on the same value of property. And if Gallagher forces the residential assessment rate to drop below 6%, as everybody expects next year, then for every dollar that homeowners pay, businesses will pay $5, a 5-to-1 ratio. And so that shift in the property tax burden has been very real and pretty significant, particularly for small business owners. So the lesson from all of this that we've learned in tax policy is you can't get something for nothing. There are winners and losers in all tax policy. If you have the Gallagher Amendment, well, the obvious winner in that equation is homeowners, because they pay a lower tax rate per the Gallagher Amendment every time property values rise. The loser in that tax policy is local public services that depend on that residential property tax base to pay for services. And the public at large also loses because they depend on those services. Rural communities lose in that in the current scenario because, again, Gallagher disproportionately impacts their tax base more so than metropolitan communities. Small businesses suffer because they have a relatively higher tax rate every time Gallagher drives the residential rate down. And the state budget suffers under the current scenario because as Gallagher drives the residential rate down and shrinks the residential property tax base and hinders the ability of local communities to fund K through 12, the state has an obligation to step in and backfill local school districts. So the state has had to assume an increasingly larger share of that K through 12 partnership. It used to be that local governments, local communities paid 2/3 of the K through 12 budget and the state paid 1/3. That was 20 years ago. Today, the state pays 2/3 and local governments pay 1/3. So that shift in the state's responsibility to the state has meant the state has less money to pay for other things like transportation and higher education. And if we can get local voters to raise local mill levies just enough to offset Gallagher's forced reduction of the residential rate, well, the winner in that scenario is local public services, because we have stabilized funding for local services by raising the mill levy, and the state budget benefits too, because to the extent we can stabilize the local revenue base, then we don't require the state to backfill K through 12. But the loser, whenever we raise the mill levy, again, is small businesses, because it shifts the tax burden to the business community. And it's particularly bad in rural communities, because rural communities have a very small commercial tax base. And some of those communities are really up against the wall in their inability to raise their local mill levy anymore, because that commercial tax base is so small and so interdependent on each other in some of these small communities where they have one hardware store, one grocery store. They can't afford to raise their mill levy anymore, or they risk losing that one hardware store or feed store or grocery store. And if they lose those critical elements of their economic infrastructure, it will contribute to the decline and the collapse of their entire economic infrastructure. So in conclusion, the Gallagher Amendment will continue to erode the residential assessment rate on houses and the corresponding tax base that funds local services, as long as residential values continue to outpace non-residential values in Colorado. And rural communities, quite unintentionally and unfortunately, will continue to suffer the greatest erosion of their tax base to fund local services. And any efforts by any community to get voters to raise local mill levies just enough to offset Gallagher's forced reduction of the residential rate will continue that shift in the tax burden from homeowners to business owners. And because Gallagher is embedded in our Constitution, which the voters adopted in 1982, if the voters want something different, only they can do that, because the legislature cannot amend the Constitution. It's up to Coloradans to change that policy if they want to. which brings me full circle to where we started out with Building a Better Colorado. Building a Better Colorado hosted a statewide conversation about the Gallagher Amendment, as well as other constitutional fiscal policy, including the Tabor Amendment and Amendment 23, the K through 12 funding mandate. We hosted that conversation last year in 37 communities around the state, including the Eagle Vale area. And we engaged about 1,800 civic leaders in that conversation. And we looked at the Gallagher Amendment. We talked about what it is, what it does, and what people thought we should do differently, if anything. And you can see here the various options that we looked at. The idea of doing nothing was very unpopular. The people whom we engaged in this conversation felt that we need to change Gallagher. And the most consensus was realized around the idea of just repealing Gallagher. There was over 72% of the audience that supported repealing Gallagher. And that was really a bipartisan support. 73% of participating Democrats embraced that idea, 66% of participating Republicans, and 70% of participating unaffiliated voters. We published this report last fall, and subsequent to that, as you noted, your state legislature has now referred this idea of repealing Gallagher to the ballot next month for voters to consider. It is known as Amendment B, and the legislature's proposal enjoyed similar bipartisan support in the legislature. Almost 80% of the legislature embraced this as well, which is highly unusual on tax policy questions. So what Amendment B would propose to do is three things. Number one, Amendment B proposes to repeal the Gallagher Amendment from the Constitution, which takes away that 45-55 frozen ratio of residential to non-residential property. It would also remove the reference in the Constitution to 21% residential assessment rate, which was the initial starting point of the residential rate back in 1982. The combination of those two repeals will effectively freeze the residential rate at 7.15% forever, unless and until the voters change that. In the same way that the assessment rate on all other property has been frozen at 29% this entire time. The third thing that the proposed Amendment B would do is it would take all of those assessment rates, which I shared with you earlier, that are in the Constitution, would take all of those assessment rates for all classes of property out of the Constitution, which means those assessment rates would only be found in statute, which is the purview of your elected legislature. And the upshot of that is that your legislature would once again then be empowered to potentially lower an assessment rate on any class of property. If they had the support to do so. They couldn't raise any assessment rate because, again, Tabor requires a vote of the people to raise any rate, but the legislature would be able to lower an assessment rate if they wanted to. And finally, just to affirm this, I get a lot of questions from people saying, well, how's it going to affect the tax rate on my house if we repeal Gallagher? And again, repealing Gallagher doesn't affect the tax rate on any class of property. It doesn't lower or raise the tax rate on your house. It doesn't lower or raise the tax rate on any class of property. All it does is stop Gallagher's formulaic erosion of the residential rate. So it would be frozen at 7.15%. So I'm going to share our website here, buildingabettercolorado.org. All of this information is on our website, as well as the recorded version of this presentation. And I have my email address up here as well, reeves@betterco.org. I'd be happy to respond to any questions that anybody might have if they email. So with that, Chris, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, Reeves Brown, thank you so much. This is a complicated issue because of all the interplay that you talked about and explained, again, in a really good layman's language that people can really get to the crux of and understand exactly what it is we're voting on with Amendment B. And we thank the Building a Better Colorado group. You have been to Eagle County a number of times at Vail Valley Partnership. We've helped you identify that bipartisan group of community leaders to provide the feedback that goes into the state effort. So we are really appreciative of you not just taking the time today, but also taking the time to do this across the state of Colorado and to bring some of these taxation issues and governance issues on how our state is funded and bring it forth to our population so our voters can make an educated decision on what's best for their communities and for themselves. Reeves, I know that Building a Better Colorado is a nonpartisan group, and thus you do not have an opinion on Amendment B. But I do want to share with our listeners and viewers that the Vail Valley Partnership Board has taken a position of support. We encourage people to vote yes to repeal Gallagher. We're joining groups from around the state, as diverse as the Denver Metro Chamber to Club 20, the Denver Post to the Grand Junction Sentinel, many newspapers and business organizations around the state, in encouraging a yes vote on Amendment B. A couple reasons for that in our limited time here. Number one, we don't believe that the ratios at all should be included in our Constitution. We think it's bad governance for ratios to be in the Constitution of the state. We also recognize the support of our special districts that drive our quality of life: schools, recreation, library, everything that you talked about earlier. And of course, as a business organization, we want to do our best to remove burdens to business and remove that increased burden to business that the Gallagher Amendment creates that you again talked about. So we appreciate you taking the time. With that, we're going to close it out. Again, for anyone looking, buildingabettercolorado.org. And Reeves Brown, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.